I'll start talking at 1. Hi, everyone. Welcome. There's some information in the chat about setting your Zoom room up, and then Dr. Kathy Supiano's email is also there if you want to jot that down. We'll start in just a minute. Okay, the clock is officially 1 o'clock, so we are going to get going. Welcome to the 2021 Intermountain Tribal and Rural Opioid Wellness Summit breakout session. This session is titled The Grief of Overdose Death and is presented by Dr. Kathy Supiano, the Director of Caring Connections, a Hope and Comfort in Grief program at the University of Utah College of Nursing. I'm your session moderator, Megan West, and I am available in the chat box at any time during the presentation. Before we get started, I have a brief housekeeping reminder, and I've put these items in the chat for you. So this breakout session, like the other sessions of the summit, is being recorded, and some content may be reproduced or broadcasted at a later time. If for any reason you wish to remain anonymous during the recording, please take the following actions now. Click the 3 dots in the upper right corner of your participant panel, choose Change Profile Name, edit your name, and then make sure your video is off by clicking the video icon in the bottom left corner of your screen. You will know it's off when there's a red diagonal. So please message me if you have any questions or have troubles. So during the presentation, to ask a question, please either use the raise hand function, which is found in the participant panel, or type your question in the chat box. All participants will be automatically muted throughout the presentation, but we can turn your mic on if you have a question, and we will have verbal questions at the end of Kathy's presentation. So now, after all of that, I would like to introduce our featured guest for this breakout session, Dr. Kathleen Supiano.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Megan, and thank you, Susie, for being here and inviting me today. I'm going to give us an overview on the unique features of overdose grief and how it impacts us as clinicians and agency staff and providers and community members. And then I'll invite you to all-day training that we'll be having later on. But one of the things I'm quite pleased with in the state of Utah is that my program has been funded to develop training for grief support for overdose death. And we are actually the only state in the United States where dedicated funds have been allocated to care for those persons grieving a death from overdose. So I'd like to start with a voice, the voices of people who have lost someone to overdose death, and join them in their experience.
Living with someone with addiction is living through hell. It literally is. It's chaotic at best, and it's heart wrenching at worst. And this will be difficult to relive. It was just surreal. It was kind of a dreary day. It was sort of sprinkling a little bit. It's as if the whole world stopped.
I remember seeing a leaf or two drop, and I just held my son. I think that he he really, really wanted to be a good kid. He just didn't know how to control what he was going through, his feelings with school, the challenges that he was having, and I know he didn't die on purpose. I think things just got carried away, and his body stopped.
His heart was just like hers, without malice, full of love.
And he genuinely cared.
So I hope you had the opportunity to hear the love and the loss and the magnitude of suffering in those parents. And that's really where I'd like to start us today. So let's start by reviewing what overdose survivors, and these would be the family members and friends of those who have lost someone to overdose death. Let's talk about what they experience. So the first thing that overdose survivors experience in their grief is this overwhelming sense of shock. This is normal, this is healthy, this is part of all forms of grief, but the nature of the shock is quite different because of the tragic, unavoidable nature of the death. There's a subset of grievers who actually live in a state of dread before the death. These are family members or friends who might have seen the person who died through many iterations of treatment, relapse, back and forth again. Yet these families too experience profound shock when the person does die from an overdose. But immediately after that sense of shock, and not fully protected by the shock, is this overwhelming sense of guilt. And this is where those who've lost someone to overdose death ascribe themselves as partially or even fully causal in the death of the person who died by overdose. These are people who say the woulda, coulda, shouldas. To use the clinical term, I should have done something. It's my fault. If I had only checked on him, if I had only not yelled at him. And so, and many families, parents in particular, feel their genetic contribution to that child was also causally related. But some families, and particularly those families that lived in a state of dread beforehand, might even feel an immediate sense of relief on the death, that their child isn't battling addiction any longer, that their husband isn't suffering any longer. But the moment they feel that sense of relief, they feel this overwhelming sense of guilt again. What kind of parent, what kind of spouse am I that I would feel relief that my person has died? But guilt, when we talk about it, we recognize that that's an internal interpretation of what's happened, where one says, this is my fault. What I did or failed to do is the answer. Whereas shame is actually the social endorsement of that phenomena. And that's when society does say, and believe me, society does say, you're a failure as a parent, you're a failure as a spouse, you're a failure as a sibling, if you lost someone to overdose death. So we live in a society, as you know, that is profoundly shaming of people with substance use disorders and profoundly shaming of those who've lost someone to substance use disorder. And after the guilt and the shame, of course, comes the blame. And this blame comes in a very natural way. This is a very unsettling form of death. And when people ask the question, why, then the answer to that must be, it has to be someone's fault. So we, in our human minds, naturally attribute causation to a catastrophic death like this. And that blame may be directed at the deceased, the person who died. I begged and begged and begged him to stop using. The blame could be directed at the social network of the deceased, the family or the friends. The blame could be directed at the failure of the treatment system, of the criminal justice system, and of the school system. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, we can blame ourselves with the guilt and the shame. Many, many families who've lost someone to overdose death also experience an overwhelming sense of anxiety. For parents in particular, they now are fearful of addiction in the other members of the family. But this anxiety is also realized as a fear of the future after this long-standing dread. So if the person who is now deceased had been in treatment and relapsed on many occasions, and that person, now the griever, has been hypervigilant, and we know hypervigilance contributes to trauma, and they can't switch it off after the person has died. Many of these grievers also bring with them a high level of suspicion about the school system, about the mental health system, and about the criminal justice system. And so a lot of ambivalence or frustration in terms of reaching out for care. And then finally, people do experience a lot of anger about overdose death. Again, they could be angry at the person who died, angry at the social network, the friends. A husband may turn to a wife and say, this is all your fault. And then also, again, the mental health system, the criminal justice system, schools, or the workplace. But we also see an incredible level of anger in grievers directed at prescribers, because we still know that a good many people who have become dependent on opioids got them through originally a legitimate prescriber. And many times grievers are furious at the medical team that originally prescribed the pain medication. And then much anger is directed at dealers. And we're seeing a lot more of this with the resurgence of meth and then illicit synthetic opioids. And one thing all of these grief experiences have in common with people who are now grieving a death is this motivates the griever toward isolation. Now, this was true before the pandemic and is even truer now in the pandemic, as nationwide, so many people grieving a death are grieving that death in solitude or isolation. But for those grieving an overdose death, just like those grieving a suicide death or a homicide death, this grief is not endorsed by society. That's called disenfranchised grief, and people are left to suffer alone. In contrast, when a family might lose a child to a motor vehicle accident or cancer, there we see the community rallying around the family who's grieving. But we still in the United States do not see this compassionate response among those who are in the social orbit of people grieving an overdose death. So let's just very quickly now talk about what grief is in general across all forms of death, and really how we can help people navigate this. A really important thing to know, and perhaps the single most important thing to know about grief, is we all have the ability to do it. Every one of us, in the beauty of our neurology and our spirits, have the capacity to grieve. And if you think about it, that's essential. When you came into the world, you came into the world as a baby, but there were already people here who loved you. You had parents, you had grandparents, perhaps siblings ahead of you. Then you have siblings that come after you and cousins, and you get married, or you have a partner, and you have children, and you have grandchildren. And so it's important to know that we don't all come into the world in one little social unit, and we don't leave the world all at the same time in a little social unit. And because in families, we come into the world and we leave the world individually, the human mind, which is social by nature, has had to develop a capacity to grieve. And people grieve in their bodies, they grieve in their brains, cognitively, their thinking, their emotions, they grieve in their spirit, and they grieve in their social units. So grief is a natural and really truly a sacred human phenomena that merits good attention and support. And usually when we think about a death, such as an overdose death, and we're involved in that situation, we're usually thinking about the death that happened just now. But it is so important for us when we're caring for grieving people to acknowledge the long history of grief. And we want to think about this in many levels. First, the grief of any individual. If an individual loses a child to an overdose death, They have also had losses in their life before, parents, grandparents, maybe someone else to an overdose death. They bring that history with them. People also bring their long history with them and their cultural history with them. And this is where we really have to acknowledge the reality of racial injustice and health disparities, that many people bring a long history of suffering and disenfranchisement to the grief that's happening now. So for example, when a person loses a family member to an overdose death and they're in an under-resourced community with limited access to services, that's a double grief. That is also having to deal with the grief of what should have been happening instead: care, support, treatment. So those past losses matter. People also, as I talked about, worrying about the death of another child by addiction, then are also worried about more grief in the future. And these griefs, particularly these long history griefs, they are not additive, they're exponential and place incredible burden on grieving people. Yet, even though we are in cultures, we're very pleased to have wide representation today with multiple tribal cultures. Some of us live in urban areas, some of us live in rural areas, some of us are members of faith communities, some of us are not. And so even though we bring all of those cultural aspects of ourselves to grief, each one of us grieves differently. So a beautiful part of grief that distinguishes it from other emotional care situations is every griever is unique and every griever grieves differently. While grief is universal, but everyone does their journey themselves. And how people experience it is really closely tied to the nature of the relationship they had with the person who died. Perhaps it was loving and close, perhaps it was fraught. And each one of us brings the other stressors that are happening in our life and our own coping skills to our grief. But for most grieving people, having the support of other human beings matters. And this is really now where cultural phenomena bubble up in very meaningful ways. We're supported by the rituals of our culture. We're supported by the norms of our religion. We're supported by the common understanding in our community. And I spent many years of my life in a very small town, and there were certain ways that certain things that happened when people were grieving, and we just knew we could count on them. But most grieving people need more than friends. They need the context of other grievers, and they may need spiritual support. We can also help grieving people by giving them permission to stay away from the people who aren't helping them. But we also need formal supports. We need rituals. This is why in the federal hospice benefit, that 13 months of bereavement care are built into that benefit and should be provided. And then we also have, there are peer support groups that are out there to protect and support people. And I've just listed one that helps grieving parents. It's called Compassionate Friends. Yet there are some grieving people, and it's actually many, who benefit from clinician facilitated support groups or individual counseling. So again, we're all here in the United States, and America is the country that loves the quick fix. And so this is how people want grief to work. And here's the death, and boy, give me my 3 bereavement days and I'm okay. Boy, let me tell you, that's what your boss wants too. But this is how grief actually works. And that is not a nice soft ball of yarn there. That is a bundle of barbed wire. And grief is messy. And as I said, individualized. So what's important now in terms of where we hope people can go in their grief? Well, this is my opportunity to tell you that there are no stages of grief. I think if you saw that ball of barbed wire, you might believe me on this. So grief is not linear, grief is not predictable, grief will have its way with you. But there are milestones along the way that are important. And first is the griever has to come to terms with the reality of the death and the permanence of the death, and to begin to imagine and create a life without the person who died. Nowhere is this harder than in spouse loss or in loss of a child. Loss of a child being pretty well established as the most devastating loss in the human experience. And I'm not minimizing sibling loss or loss of a friend or loss of a spouse or loss of a parent, but there really is nothing in the world that prepares an individual for the loss of a child. So that's a lot. Then as the person holds that person who died in memory, they take the love that would have gone to that person and they invest it in other places. Here's a very important observation about the recovery community, in that many, many people who work in substance use disorder programs or become substance use disorder therapists have their own history with substance use difficulties, either in their family or in themselves. And so they bring this genuineness. And so they take their own suffering and they invest it in something else. But here's the step that I actually think is the most critical when we grieve a sudden or traumatic death, such as an overdose death. That we have this memory of the person in our mind. And at the start, because of the very tragic and traumatic nature of the death, it feels like static electricity in your brain. And it kind of looks like that on your face. This is where the thoughts, the feelings, the memories, the trauma, the devastation, the visual image, if you found the person who died, is all this chaos. In time, in grief, and with supports, we hope that softens into a very realistic but balanced, loving memory of the person who died. Watch my hand here. And that we hope over time that the circumstances of the death by overdose, can move from the center of the grief off to the side. If you can see my hand, it's in my periphery, where it's still real. We're not pretending it's not an overdose death, but that is not how you define your relationship with the person who died. So a key part of grief is to have a continuing relationship with the person who died that is not defined by the circumstances of the death. So when we think about a sudden death like an overdose death, these are the things that make people at higher risk for a bad grief experience. But I want to highlight two. First, the longer the griever believes that they're causally related to the death is a greater risk for complicated grief. And then if the griever is the person who found the person who died or might have even witnessed the death, they will have a much harder time in their grief. So those with the highest risk of grief outcome, of poor grief outcome, those who are completely devastated by the loss and feel I have nothing left, those who have an emotional experience that's overwhelming, or perhaps and very commonly had depression or anxiety before the death, those who remain very isolated. And it's important that we recognize perceived isolation. Many people live in communities, but they live a solitary existence in a community. And the other thing I do have to mention is we, in the United States and in the West in particular, we tend to burden each other with expectations. Don't cry, be strong, get over it, snap out of it. And the Western expression of all, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. All of those are hurtful to grieving people. But grief as a mental health situation, of course, physical as well, spiritual, emotional, is very different from depression or anxiety. In depression and anxiety, I'm a therapist too. We want to cure it. And if we can't cure it, we want to manage it. But grief isn't like that. It's a natural phenomena. And remember, we cannot take away the pain from the bereaved. Our best gift to grieving people is to companion them through this journey with compassion again and again, listening to the story of the death, and then as time goes on, listening to the story of the life that was lost. Bringing people the comforts and kindnesses that we would with other forms of death. Giving people the confidence that they can manage, not the be strong message, but I'm here to support you and I'm confident that you can do this. Very different message. And then referrals for professional support as needed. What doesn't work? Telling people your own grief story. Inappropriately premature spiritual support. Now, I'm a spiritual person. Spiritual support is really important, but this is talking about don't be the voice of God here, okay? Don't tell people about God's plan, because I mean, we'll just leave that to God to do. But basically to support people's disruption in their faith is appropriate. I also want to mention, and this is important in substance use disorder treatment audiences, that there is no medication for grief. There's no grief pill. However, if people are receiving treatment for a medical problem, and that includes medication-supported substance use disorder treatment, or if they have treatment for depression or anxiety before the death, continue those. But we really think sleep medicine is actually more hurtful for the grief process than helpful. So thinking about yourself and your own role, be aware of your own scope of practice as you care for grieving people. Maybe you're a friend, maybe you're a nurse, maybe you're a school psychologist, maybe you're a social worker. Each one of us have very defined roles, and it's all right that we stick with our role. Be aware of your own loss issues. If you're dealing with a fresh grief, this one may not have your name on it, and so you use your colleagues or your services. Be aware of your own time and stamina. You cannot support grieving people with a one and done. You have to measure your willingness to be involved, but please be involved. Know your community resources. If you need guidance on community resources, my program, grief program, is connected to other programs. We're happy to help if you need information about grief resources. And for goodness sakes, this is hard work. Practice self-care. So let me share this video now with you. And I hope the sound is working for you. It's working for me.
We didn't see her dying as a risk. We saw the risk of her
Being a vegetable, that's what I
being-
saw.
losing her job,
Yeah.
not having any way to support
Being
herself.
disabled.
And so this was, it turned us upside down, you know.
It's very cyclical. In the beginning, I'd be driving down the street just perfectly fine, and thinking I knew everything about grief because I was a nurse and I heard Kubler-Ross speak, blah, blah, blah. And it would hit me, and it would be a visceral hit. And I'd have to pull over, which I didn't expect that. I thought I could outthink it. And you can't. The few times I talked to my older boy, the one that was just younger than Jamie, he's real angry and he doesn't like to talk about it. But the few times I have, I've tried to explain to him, Jamie was a mess those last few years, and she caused more trouble than you can believe, and she was always into the drama. But that's not what I'm grieving. I'm grieving the daughter that I thought I was going to have. And that until I found her dead, I didn't give up hope of that. I thought we could make it happen. And once again, I've been shown that I don't control things. Being a doctor, that, you fix things and, sew it up and make it better, and all the things we did didn't do it. And I think even intellectually he knows he's not a failure, but I think he feels failure. There's nothing I can say to change your pain, but just know that in a year or two, maybe 3. The devastating things you feel will have more time in between. They'll be less frequent that you feel hip and truck.
It was horrible. I mean, how do you lose a person that was there with you all the time, that you loved and that you knew loved you so much, and how I don't, it's almost inexplainable. It's just a piece of your heart is gone, you know? He was like my right arm. He would say, "Now, Mom, if there's anything I can do to help you, please let me know, you know, please." And I'd go get him, and he planted a tree for me in the front yard. It's a raised tree. It's beautiful, and it has heart leaves that go gold in the fall. I love that tree, and it has those little pink buds, and it's just, I mean, he was just always there for me, always there for me.
And I think, you know, I think back to those first few months, and I think that I've repressed a lot of it.
At this time, he had his 2 sisters and his nephew living with us in the house. And surprisingly, his older sister, who's a social worker, no less, she couldn't tolerate it. And they couldn't be in the same room together. They totally broke communication, period. He was willing to, you know, he was sorry, but she couldn't forgive him. And so if we had one to have dinner with us, Ray would always back down and stay in his room. And so it was horrible. They have no relationship, no, none, just.
Well, I think we argued a lot. And I think Polly, you know, more than I, just, we've got to do something. We've got to do something. And I don't know. I don't know what more we can do. But it was very, very tough on our relationship. It still is.
It's been horrible. I mean, it was, it didn't make sense. It didn't make sense at all. And, you know, just the emotional, you know, like Tom said, it was a dreary day. I remember seeing a leaf or 2 drop, and I just held my son, and when I saw him covered and zipped up in the bag, it was horrible. And I have regrets that I didn't touch his body before he left. And the whole year, Tom and I have talked, the first year, it is a complete fog. You just we don't remember anything. And it wasn't until he passed away, 2017 in November, and it wasn't until July until I was ready to accept that he really wasn't coming back.
I remember that day, every single bit of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Every single second. But I don't remember the following, that Thanksgiving or Christmas. I just don't even remember hardly any of it. And in the holidays, so in a lot of ways, this holiday was really seemed kind of fresh. It was the first time I could really feel it and think it. And the grieving process is weird because, you know, you grieve at first and you just ask them why. And then it's just little things you see that trigger you. Kids that look just like him, you know.
To graduate from college, to figure out what he wanted to do. He was an amazing skier. He was on the ski team. He was just a beautiful skier. He was very athletic. imagine him graduating, getting a wonderful job, being happy, getting married, having children. And I was very excited we were so close. And I was actually closer to him than my other children. And just go through life and experience him getting older. And it's just hard to realize that I won't get to experience all these lifetime experiences with him, and it's really hard. And it's hard to be up with his other brothers and be positive and this last 6 weeks, I just have cried and cried and cried, and I found a lot of peace and hiking and kind of connecting with him, because if I'm by myself and my dog, and it just doesn't seem to go away. And my father passed away 6 weeks later, and I just feel really beaten up.
Her biggest fear is, excuse me, her biggest fear is that people are going to forget Carson.
I'm afraid for the future. I'm afraid. Not necessarily afraid, but I just feel like there will be a void as I watch his friends and my friends' friends that are the same age, do all the things that Carson would have done. And I know he would have done because he talked about it. And that part is really hard. That part is really hard. And it's hard for me to be around my nieces and nephews and see what they're doing. And he is a sweet, compassionate, most giving kid I've ever seen.
So this is what we're doing about that. We have an enormous loss in our nation, an unprecedented loss of those dying this unnecessary death from overdose. And I commend you for your prevention efforts, and I commend you for your treatment efforts. But until these deaths stop happening, we are going to have to care compassionately for those who have lost someone to overdose death. So we've developed a training program for clinicians and for community members to address the grief of overdose death. We've developed a manual for a grief support group, and you're seeing an image of the facilitator manual here. We also have a participant manual. It's evidence-based, and it's a modification of the group manual we use here at Caring Connections. It's adapted for the unique grief of overdose death. This approach is suitable not only for group support, but for individual counseling and family support. What we offer in our training are two components in an all-day training. The first part of the training is for any professional who works in a situation where drug or overdose death occurs. This would include law enforcement, first responders, healthcare professionals, mental health and substance use administrative personnel, and those people developing policy. We're really interested in those people developing policy. And what we do is this curriculum, we give people the overview of this sort of death so that if they're first responders, if they're death investigators from the coroner's office, if they're the police and they're dealing with a family that's lost someone to overdose death, they can have the skills to have a compassionate and effective, meaning getting the information that they need, response. But the second half of the day is specifically for agency staff, mental health staff, substance use disorder treatment programs, these clinicians, interventionists, and direct care staff. We're targeting police as well in the Office of Medical Examiner, community and hospital-based mental health and medical personnel, et cetera. Also clergy. So clinicians and all other interested professionals who are called upon to address those grieving an overdose death. And so we have a longer curriculum for that day. And the full day, the morning and the afternoon sessions are taught in the same day. We'll give people an overview of the intervention and include 6 continuing education credits. So if you saw the manual where I gave you the image, we have a participant manual embedded in the facilitator manual and also has the content that is included in the training. We focus also on how to take a detailed grief assessment so you can see people's progress over time, and supportive content for the interventionist or the facilitator. So here is one of the things we teach in our training, how to do that loss inventory and grief intake. Here's just a screenshot of the supportive materials that preface every section in the manual and prepare the facilitator for that day's session. And then here is the orientation to the group for participants. And I do emphasize this. I know many of you work in treatment agencies, and so you're very familiar with group work. And it is important that we stress that group work, which is so valuable and so effective, is the one form of treatment where we cannot guarantee confidentiality. And so we really encourage participants to join on that full level of confidentiality, as well as consistency and other requirements for group participation. So what we've designed is this whole day training to train clinicians in this approach with the idea of implementing it in their own practice agency. And so in that afternoon session, we do practice of each of the sessions, including role plays. Those role plays are actually all renamed, but they're former clients of mine. And then we do part of our training emphasizes compassion fatigue. I'm hoping you're enjoying these 2 days off coming to this, this conference, but I don't think I need to tell any of you that this is actually exhausting work to be involved in the care of people with substance use disorders and their families. We can all use more self-care. And then finally, the last part of the training that we emphasize is how to support agencies supporting the bereaved. So we care very much about agencies and about individual clinicians, as well as the police who lose people to overdose death. We are concerned that clinicians in this area of practice, if they deal with repeated deaths of clients that they have cared for, will leave the field. We don't want that to happen. We know we have law enforcement programs and services and the court system that are just burning out from the overload of overdose death. And so the last part of this all-day training is to equip agencies. So what we're doing is we're doing the training, and we're very generous support has been received from the state of Utah Division of Human Services. We're quite grateful for their support. And they have allowed us to have ongoing peer supervision with people doing this intervention using distance peer supervision, and we're able to provide gift cards to interventionists doing this model of care. I just did want to share another perspective as we prepare for our question time. We did just complete an 8-session grief support program in one of our substance use disorder treatment programs here in Salt Lake City. It was very well received. The grief group participants said that it gave them an opportunity to talk about loss in a way they hadn't since they were in the early stages of addiction. We are really committed to this idea of bringing the grief support model into treatment programs themselves. So if you're a clinician working in a substance use disorder agency, I would just like you to think about this question. Pose this question about any one of your clients and in dialogue with them. Do you feel that there has been a loss in your life, a traumatic death of a family member or a friend that precipitated or contributed to your involvement with substances that have been destructive in your life. And do you feel that this unrelenting grief, this unaddressed grief, contributes to your current use or your tendency to relapse? If you have clients that would answer that question, oh yes, let me tell you the story about my dad. Let me tell you the story of losing my child to suicide. These are people who, while they are in your treatment program, will benefit from having grief support integrated into the overall treatment plan of care. So one of the group members spoke these words as she finished her grief support group, and her treatment is ongoing. She continues in that treatment program. She said, once I got it, I couldn't drown the death of my dad. I could see that his death was not my fault. And I think all of you will get the metaphor. When she says, I couldn't drown the death of my dad, she means with alcohol. So this is a woman who endorsed the reality that she felt she had caused her dad's death when she was a little girl, and she drank that pain away. So loss and these traumatic losses, this unattended grief, is a huge part of why people gravitate toward substance misuse and get caught in this horrible web. So let's give that the attention and the care that it needs. And so I know some people on this call are not from Utah. What you are seeing here in this beautiful picture is the Spiral Jetty, which is a man-made art formation on the northern arm of the Great Salt Lake, as seen under the starry skies of the Milky Way. So that's my warm share with you today. So because of this grant, we have free trainings, and we are offering these around the state. We've been doing them by Zoom in the time of COVID. So if you would like clinicians or staff from your agency to be trained in this model, it is free. If you would like to participant manuals for the Overdose Grief Support Program, and you would like this training, and I will have a badge that says qualified in 2021. Those are the ones we're giving out now. My contact information is here. We're eager to enroll more people in the training and to get them involved. So in this conference, all of you should have received this invitation in your packet. And it has registration for a virtual training that we're doing Monday, June 21st, and an in-person training that we're doing in July. Very delighted to have you included. And I'm really grateful for Susie, who's moderating this call, and Tim Keaty, who's on this call, for helping us set up these upcoming trainings. These are not the only two that we'll do. We try to get several of these done every 6 weeks or so. So please reach out to me. I'm also happy to do a training that's specific for your own agency. So please reach out. And now just one thought as we close, before I close my screen. We are living in the time of COVID, and many of you are also caring for people who've lost someone to COVID, or what we are calling COVID affected deaths. And so we are offering our annual memorial event on Tuesday, May 25th, and that information is there. This is also free to the public, and we have a fascinating presentation that evening, free, and just something to support you in the time of grief. So I wanted to leave time for questions, and I thank you all for your good attention today. I think, Megan, you're our chat box captain.
Yes.
If there are any questions, I'm happy to do that until you all tell me to go away.
The only one I've seen is, would you talk about doing the training for people outside of Utah?
Yes, I would be happy to. And so, and Megan knows this. Megan and one of her colleagues and I presented at a conference in Las Vegas it was our chance to go to Las Vegas, but it was on Zoom. So we didn't get to Las Vegas, but we had people from around the country, and we just finished a training last week, and we had people from Texas and California and Maryland. And yeah, we're very happy to do this. I'm a big believer in not being the only one doing grief work. I would like as many people to do this as possible. And we also have materials on suicide grief, and then also sudden and unexpected death in the time of COVID. So happy to provide these resources to you.
And they are so helpful and amazing. Okay,
Oh,
we
and
just
then-
got one.
Yeah, Karen, is it Karen or Kieran? Karen? Any recommendations on how to grieve a child in a coma as a result of an overdose? So Karen, just to be clear, this is a person, a child, I believe, who is still alive. And I am so sorry for this experience. You have many difficult decisions to make. There is a small, I don't want to say a benefit, but you have both the burden of a sudden and unexpected loss, as well as a rare opportunity to say goodbye, if this does end in death. And it may not, so I'm not going to make that assumption, but I would say things are kind of ominous now. My recommendation, and I want you to know I'm speaking from a place of knowledge here. I am a palliative care social worker, and I have been at the bedside with many families in this situation. I encourage you to be as present as you are able to be. And I don't know if the hospital still has visitor restrictions or you're able to be there. But whether this child lives or dies, your presence and the words you say while you're present and your touch is meaningful and perceived, whether this child is leaving the world or whether this child is coming back. And I say that only having seen this many times, having seen people respond and come back into this world with lots of work to do, or as they exit this world. So just as you lived your life present in this child's life, please continue that. Physical touch and sound really matter. They really matter. If there are more questions and you would like to follow up with me later, Karen, I'm very willing to do that. Okay, Michelle, I'm in recovery at a major loss of my nephew who called my little brother. He died by suicide. Yes. So Michelle, you're at a tipping point. Please reach out and get support around you, not just for your continued recovery, but for your grief. I hope I made it very clear to you, even though we're designed to grieve, we will do this better with other people. So people who loved this nephew, called your little brother that he died, please reach out to that community of support. Please reach out to your sober community. You will feel the grief more deeply, but more honestly. And instead of it taking the rest of your life, you will be able to do this in a way that truly honors the life of the person that you lost. Again, here, and the circumstances of the death are out here, that will be very hard work. Okay, 7 years, it's so hard. Yes, it's still so hard. But also, please reach out to us. Let us connect you to a grief support group. Let us help you find that and keep that blessed sobriety. Okay, and a lot of pain for all of us, but for you, Karen, and you, Michelle, just the willingness to share this in this community of compassionate people who care about these issues. I hope you didn't just hear my voice. I hope you allowed yourself to feel the embrace of everyone here 7 years ago. All right, thank you for the courage to grieve that
Yeah,
in reality.
the vulnerability. Thank you.
I think you've inspired other people on this call today too. Isn't
So
that interesting how the lives touch?
the world is very small when you let it be, I think, and connected. Well, if there are no other questions, I want to thank Dr. Supiano so much for her knowledge and expertise. We appreciate everyone taking the time to be a part of the summit today. We want to thank our sponsors, the Utah Department of Human Services, Division of Substance Abuse and Mental Health, the Rural Health Association of Utah, Utah State University, USU Emmett Eccles Jones College of Education and Human Services Department of Kinesiology and Health Sciences, USU College of Humanities and Social Sciences, USU Extension, and SAMHSA. So I've shared the hashtags in the chat. If you don't mind sharing your experience on social media using those hashtags so we can see what you've learned or what you've enjoyed or what's come up for you during these sessions. We'd love to hear about it. And then the main room is available for any general summit questions or help getting into your next session. And I will put that link in right now. And remember, if you need the password, it is opioid. Singular, not plural, so use that link. And then tomorrow, the main sessions include building a recovery-ready community, the Indigenous Prevention, Treatment and Recovery Panel, a special project presentation titled End the Stigma, sharing stories of opioid use disorder and harm reduction in Utah, and informative breakout sessions will be held all afternoon. So make sure that you sign in again tomorrow, use that link, and thank you for coming. Susie, is there anything else?
Yeah, thank you everybody for joining us today. And I just remind everybody that Tim's naloxone education will be coming up next, as well as a session from Maren Voss on certified peer support. So join us again for the next session. And thank you all for joining today and listening to Dr. Supiano. We look forward to seeing you at one of the trainings this summer or in the future. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.